Hey everybody, so here's a little panel discussion I took part in on Skype a few days ago discussing 80s horror movies. The panel consisted of me, Cecil from GoodBadFlicks, Rossatron, and Mr. H from Mr. H Reviews. If you're not familiar with any of the guys I just mentioned, go check them out. We discussed stuff like our favorite 80s horror movies, what makes 80s horror movies special, favorite scenes, favorite actors. Bit of conflicting opinions on the new Halloween movie in there as well, but we mostly stick to 80s stuff. And we even got an introduction by none other than Barbara Crampton. Yeah, if you've seen my videos, you know who she is. So I'll stop boring you with my introduction so we can get to hers. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Barbara Crampton. You know me from Re-Animator, From Beyond, and most recently, Puppet Master, The Littlest Reich. You're listening to In Search of Darkness, YouTube creator, 80s horror special. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. This is David Weiner, director of the documentary In Search of Darkness, a journey into iconic 80s horror. Today, we're going to talk about 80s horror movies, our love of the genre, our favorite picks, and why these movies continue to have such a huge influence on the cinematic landscape. With me is Darkness co-producer Jessica Dwyer, and we are joined by a quartet of great YouTube creators who also happen to be huge fans of 80s horror. Cecil Trachenburg of GoodBadFlicks, Mr. H of Mr. H Reviews, Ross of Rossatron, and Brandon Tenold of Brandon's Cult Movie Reviews. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Let's dive into it. Let's dive right into it. And we're going to start with our favorites. And we're going to talk about our 3 favorite horror movies. What are your top 3 80s horror movies and why? Cecil, you want to go first?
Sure. I will go with The Thing, the John Carpenter one, obviously, the Fly remake, and Phantasm 2. I figured I would throw in a little bit of a curveball there.
A silvery curveball.
Yes, a silvery curveball from the tall man himself, who I met a few years back, and he was awesome. I was glad I got to meet him before he died. What a great guy he was. But anyway, all 3 of them they're just amazingly well done films. The Thing has an atmosphere and a sense of foreboding that it does not exist in other films. The Fly has some of the most amazing practical effects ever filmed. And Phantasm 2 is just a really good time. It took a lot of the aspects, what made the original one work, and really expanded upon them, made it a much bigger universe, made everything so much more effective. And it's just a really good time and a cool movie. And I love all 3 of them dearly.
Wonderful choices. Mr. H, what are your thoughts?
Wow, I'm going to disappoint you. Picked two of my things that I was going to say, so I have to rack my brains and change it. Nah, it's fine. I will still say The Thing, but I'll knock off The Fly, which was on my list. So The Thing, absolutely, again, say John Carpenter one, along with Hellraiser. I'm surprised that one didn't get a mention. And outside of The Fly, I would probably say Child's Play. Hellraiser to me, I mean, Child's Play is not scary at all, of course, but it's. I think it solidifies 80s. It is 80s in its kind of tongue-in-cheek tone, and I think that deserves a. Even though it's not actually scary, I still think it deserves a mention. But Hellraiser will always be up there as one of my all-time great and favorite horror films. It's such a fantastic film in terms of the supposed sinister evil not actually being the demonic aesthetical creatures that you see, and it's actually the human aspect, which I think is an interesting twist when you start to look at the movie like that, as opposed to the Cenobites are the evil parts to the movie. They're really not. They're just workers going about their business, day-to-day life. And the Thing is a masterclass in paranoia. It's exceptional, and Child's Play is just funny. I mean, you can't hate Brad Dourif and his voice. It's awesome.
A quick little side thing about Hellraiser. I also love Hellraiser. I think it's amazing. But Dan Aykroyd, who is a big horror fan, thinks that Hellraiser is one of the greatest comedies ever made.
I think that. Right.
I think that's the vodka talking.
I think that's comedic. Jesus Christ.
I can see the Cenobites like going to work with their briefcase every morning. I mean, they have lives too, and I think if one day we might get the other side of their existence. That's the more mundane. I think that might be kind of interesting to go about. How about Ross? Ross, how do you feel?
Yeah, I'm going to start with what I'm surprised not mentioned is Evil Dead 2. I think I must have seen Evil Dead 2 more than any film that's probably not Star Wars, just because it's an immensely watchable film, and it's excessive, but not in the way a lot of 80s films are excessive. And I think what Raimi did in terms of balancing the elements of that have never really been matched. Although in horror comedy, it may have been matched by my other one, which would be American Werewolf in London. Because I just think that is a masterclass in horror comedy as well. For some reason, even though I'm not the biggest comedy guy when it comes to the 80s, sometimes two of them are horror comedies. And then a couple have been mentioned but I'm going to have to go with The Shining, which is obviously like quite early on and very unique, I think, from a lot of 80s horror. But for me, kind of is one of the greatest films of all time, not just one of the greatest 80s or horror films or anything like that. Like the level of just suspense and sheer real, I don't know what the word would be, like I want to say horror again, but the fear that you feel for the characters because you like them, you care for them the way Danny is. It's just been unmatched really in certain elements of that film.
Brandon, what are your thoughts? What are your favorites?
I'm also going to pick The Thing again, not only because, as Cecil was saying, there's just a great sense of tension throughout the movie, and also because they just absolutely went for broke with the gore and practical effects. They didn't care if that pissed off people in 1982, which, if you look at the reviews, apparently it did. And it's easy to be jaded by that at the time, but in 1982, it was like they were saying, like, oh, you thought the chestburster sequence in Alien was gross? Well, we're going to have several of those that go way further than that throughout the entire movie. What do you think of that?
And we'll just have a chest that eats you, period.
Yeah. Exactly. Weird and pissed off. Yeah,
so that one, and I'm also going to pick both Evil Dead 1 and 2 for different reasons. Evil Dead 1 because that's a great example of showing how you can make a low-budget horror movie that's not only effective but also really stylish. Like some of the shots he was able to pull off with the limited amount of money and time and the harsh conditions they were working with on that movie is still amazing. And then Evil Dead 2 just for a great way to, because American Werewolf in London is, the comedy's a bit more dry, and then Evil Dead 2 shows how effectively you can combine horror with just complete screwball. If the Three Stooges, if they were actually able to show the harm they were doing to each other with what was happening. So those are my three picks.
Three Stooges without pulling the punches, literally.
Yeah.
Jessica, what are your top three?
I went with because everybody loves Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th and all of those. Evil Dead's kind of a given. So I went with three kind of different. And first is Fright Night because I think it's a perfect movie. I just love that it kind of bridges the gap between the classics with Roddy McDowall, and then you have that modern slick vampire and Jerry Dandridge, and it had one of the best soundtracks I think in the 80s. And then the other one was Something Wicked This Way Comes because I love that Disney made that movie. And it's a Ray Bradbury story that deals with, human failings and desires. And Jonathan Pryce was a god in that movie. I thought it was fantastic. And the fact, again, that Disney made a movie where this guy is surrounded by half naked women, and Pam Grier is a gypsy fortune teller in it, and she looks amazing. And the other was The Company of Wolves, which I think has one of the most fantastic werewolf transformations ever. And it just deals with it's got a lot of things going on, and it's just such a surreal, weird, cool, beautifully done movie. So my question for you guys, we know we've talked about comedy and horror, but horror is about being afraid. What 80s horror films really scared you the first time you saw them, and why? How did they get to you? Cecil, go first.
Well, going to, since it was just recently mentioned, Creepshow, the whole movie in general, it's really good. It's not tremendously scary. It has a lot of humor in there until the last segment. They're creeping up on you. I am not a fan of bugs, and the whole thing with him with the roaches, and then the end, him just erupting with roaches, it terrified me. Like I felt like stuff was crawling on me for like days. Because I saw that I was a little too young to be watching that to begin with. Because I had my sister was a really big horror fan, and she's the reason why I got into horror, because she would kind of, watch this chicken, and I'm like, and I got wigged out, and that always bothered me and still bothers me. Like I'll just sit there and just wince as like there's coming out of his mouth and his eyes, and it's horrible.
Mr. H, why don't you go?
That's a difficult one to answer, really. For me, I don't find creatures and things scary, because it's just the differentiation. Like I know that stuff can never happen, but I find people, when they're properly directed and the story's well constructed, to be the most unnerving. I wouldn't say scary, but it's the most unnerving, because people having like a psychotic break is one of those things which can definitely happen. So you can actually put yourself in the shoes, and then you empathize and actually have a little bit of fear from that. So overall, I would probably say either The Shining or The Thing. And not because the creatures, they're an awesome, they're a masterclass in practical effects, but it's not so much the creatures, but it's more the intense paranoia that everyone experiences within that situation. And like, and same with The Shining, people essentially having a mental breakdown. Mm-hmm. Those are the things which I would say, again, like it's a toss up between The Shining and The Thing. But it's a more tangible fear for me, as opposed to, I don't know, like Freddy Krueger, for instance. Like I don't care about that. It's not scary, but that's a tangible fear. When done right, I think it's fantastic, which it was done right in the 80s.
Would you say it's kind of like the loss of yourself? The loss of self is the most terrifying thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's not, I don't project myself into the movie in the sense of I would have a mental break, but I think that people on a whole experience things very differently, experience the world very differently. And as such, I mean, you only have to read a newspaper. People have mental breaks all the time. And the damage that's done as a cause, the after effect of that is insane. So it's the fact that those things can actually happen. People just losing their mind basically, and the aftermath of that. So yeah, I'd say it's a real possibility, and when produced properly in a movie, that's the real unnerving kind of horror, which I appreciate. All work and no play.
Exactly. Yeah, I know if that I lose my brains at work all the time. So Ross, what about you? What really truly scared you in the 80s from the world of horror films?
Well, the thing from the 80s that really scared me more than anything wasn't a horror movie, which would be E.T. Found that absolutely terrifying. But I'm going back to when I was about 4 years old. But if I was gonna, and still creeped, I don't know why people don't creeped out when he goes Elliot and comes out the little shed thing, and he's like, oh. It's like, that's terrifying when you're a kid, like genuinely. But I remember I don't even remember the film. I didn't see much of it. I've seen it since, but at the time I only saw this bit. But I remember seeing Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and the opening where the kid, and I was about 8 or something, and Freddy comes off a wall as a puppet and slices open his arms and rips out like his tendons and veins and turns him into a puppet and then leads him off the roof and throws him. And I found that the most horrifying and just terrifying image that kept me up. And just the fact that Freddy was this small thing that came out of the shadows and did that, and then led him in front of all of his friends and threw him. And there's the sheer pain that kid must have felt. I'd never seen pain of that level in a film, I think, as a kid. And that just destroyed me for about a week.
I think that's a part of 80s filmmaking, is that with the horror genre, by that stage of the game, everyone was really looking to be as creative as possible in their horror and their dismemberment.
Well, in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, you had unlimited imagination with that because of the dream sequences. Mm-hmm. You really allowed them to really go for it, which is why some of those movies are just beautiful and horrifying at the same time. I get that.
They got to me more than anything as a kid, for sure.
Nice. So, Brandon, what really, truly scared you?
I don't know if you'd consider this a horror movie, but one that had a big effect on me when I first saw it was the movie Aliens. And that's probably because of how old I was. I think it was around 7 when I first saw that movie. And that's one where, it's thought of as like the action movie sequel to Alien. And they kind of forget that it still has a lot of horror movie elements in it. Like I remember when they first go into the alien hive, and then they find a woman who's cocooned up, and he lifts her head up, and then her eyes open, and then the alien bursts out of her chest. Mm-hmm. And, that part got me. And then, I was a little kid, so I had no idea where the story was going. So, parts like at the end where you think they're safe back on the ship, and then the alien queen's tail goes through Lance Henriksen and rips him in half. So that had a big impact on me when I first saw it.
Milk does a body good. That's what that movie taught me. All right. Well, David, what really scared you?
Well, I have to say that The Shining, going back to The Shining and whatever happened in room 237, it still haunts me to this day. I want to move forward and talk about horror 80s horror aesthetic. And in 80s horror, when you think of it, what comes to mind? What about the creative element of filmmaking and imagination do you guys think really defines that decade? Cecil?
It has to come down to practical effects. Practicals is becoming, sadly, a lost art. And that goes beyond just the effects. It also goes into the sets, the matte paintings, the locations they use. So much creativity that goes into there. And now a lot of times it's just they'll take a horror film and they'll put somebody in front of a green screen and then just add in 10 tons of CG, and like the person's reacting to something that's not there. And so you're not really getting the performance you'd be getting if you had somebody in a suit, or you had them covered in slime, or you had something else, for them to be interacting with. I think that there are still some good horror movies that will use CG. I'm not saying that it completely is useless, but I think that it's becoming a crutch rather than a tool. Instead of using it to enhance, it's just like, well, we'll just fix this, we'll just do this, whatever. And it ends up like looking fake. It ends up looking phony. And that's why when you go back and you look at something like The Thing or The Fly, it's still terrifying. Whereas movies from just a couple of years ago, you go back and watch them and everybody was free. Oh, it was so scary. And you go back and it's just bad CG of somebody's mouth opening really wide, or 10 tons of jump scares instead of actual, like, atmosphere and genuine scares. So I think that first and foremost, practicals are really a huge part of why the 80s are the way they are. And thankfully, it is making a little bit of a comeback, mostly through independent means. We've got like The Void. We've got Turbo Kid, which isn't a horror film, but it's got, horror film elements in it. And it's just nice to see. So it's not completely dead, but it's I'd say it's dead in Hollywood.
Yeah, when it's very hard to get, really good appropriate response when people are looking at a tennis ball on a stick. It doesn't quite elicit the same response. Mr. H, do you have a similar feeling about that?
I'm surprised no one said score. What's going on? I mean, if you're thinking about 80s, yeah, I mean, I know we said aesthetic, but the score is what encapsulates the entire movie. And the 80s was profound for that. I appreciate practical effects as much as the next guy, but I think 80s is synonymous with absolutely incredible scores. And it went well away in the 90s and 2000s. And it's starting to come back a little bit now. Like, use of score it's hit or miss, but they are putting a little bit more emphasis on it. But yeah, score. I would out and out say score. Above all else, actually, to be honest.
Ross, what do you think is a sort of unique element to 80s horror and its aesthetic?
I think it's part of, for me, what the 80s were in a way. It's the excess of everything, which kind of does cover all of it. There was a breadth of what was available, and they pushed everything to its extreme, like the gore in something like The Thing, or your haunted house movie became Poltergeist, where they pushed everything about as far as it could go. Even like Stanley Kubrick adapting Stephen King, who also was being adapted left and right into anything they could get. And the fact that just almost like yearly sequels of horror films, again, pushed into that excess. It wasn't always good, but that defined it for me, that they just pushed everything as far as they could for money, just to see if they could do it. The effects, the music, giving young filmmakers like whatever they could to just go out there and make something mental, making Texas Chainsaw 2 the way they made that. Like, there was such an excess to everything in the 80s that we have, for better or worse, kind of moved away from. And that was in even action and Commando and Porky's in comedy and things. They just went all the way with everything they could to one up each other.
Ross, what are your thoughts?
I just answered.
I'm sorry. Brandon, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Cecil mentioned practical effects, and then another thing I think is important is that they also really let you see them as well. Like, they didn't have like the ultra fast editing. If a movie had crazy neon colors or anything like that, it was because they actually did that on set with lights and not because they color corrected the shit out of it later. So they were crazy, but the aesthetic was a little bit cleaner. They let you appreciate what they did a little bit more, I think. When they had jump scares, there's exceptions to this, of course, but when they had jump scares, they usually earned them first. They'd build to them rather than just continuously faking you out, which is in 90s horror movies that I think that especially was a big problem with fake jump scares where there was a huge like sting on the musical score to let you know that, hey, you're supposed to be scared here. So that was another thing where, yeah, it was the 80s pushed the boundaries, but also let you actually see and appreciate that they were pushing boundaries as well.
Yeah, I would think also franchises, sequels, that was something that really was encouraged and exploded in that decade. They wanted more, and everyone wanted to have their own iconic character. So there are a lot of introductions to that, a lot of additional things where you have, if Jason was doing really, really well and Michael Myers can come back and continue to do well, then you've got Pinhead, then I think it was fair game, and everyone did try their hand at that.
Yeah, and I would actually include that, agreeing with everybody, not only just scores, but soundtracks were huge. People were really taking advantage of the music at the time. And you would have, like, I could listen to the Fright Night soundtrack, the Lost Boys soundtrack. I wore those tapes out. And yes, I said tapes because I'm old. But also, that was the rise of the special effects gods. They became as big as stars as the actors, like Savini and Nicotero really came into their own. You got Rick Baker winning Oscars right and left, and those guys really became known. You would be like, okay, that's a Nicotero zombie, or that's a Savini zombie. You start hearing that in the 80s. That's really what I took away from it, was that's when the special effects guys got their due.
Let's move to the next question, Jessica.
Yes, please. So horror movies from the 80s are known as somewhat, they'll call them quote unquote guilty pleasures. And I won't say that. I'll say it's my secret love. So what is your secret love from the 80s in the horror genre? What movie do you secretly love, but you know people are going to probably judge you for saying it? Cecil, we'll start with you.
I kind of like I come from a different school as far as like guilty pleasures and secret loves and all that stuff. I think that you should never be ashamed of liking something. If you like it, you want to tell people about it. You want other people to like it too. And if they don't like it, well, they just don't see like the brilliance of it or the enjoyment of it. So I've made largely a channel about trumpeting all the stuff that I like. That movie sucks, that movie's terrible. I'm like, no, you're wrong, and so a good one that I always love to talk about because it is scary, hilarious, gory, just everything in the kitchen sink is Pieces. Because it's exactly what you think it is, as the tagline puts it. You've got bad dubbing, you've got a nonsensical plot, you've got kung fu in the middle of the movie for no reason. It's amazing and wonderful and just a fantastic movie. And I'm glad that over the years, it's become more and more appreciated for being what it is and just being the exploitation schlock that they weren't setting out to make a great movie. They were setting out to make just a gory mess that people would enjoy, and they succeeded.
Mr. H, can you follow up Pieces?
No, well, I don't think I can follow up that. But I'm very similar. Like I don't really have guilty pleasures, to be honest. I quite like it, I guess, like a lame horror movie. I guess we can just call it that, a lame horror movie. And I don't think it's lame, but I mean, just generally speaking, it's a bit lame. Is Pumpkinhead. Yeah, like,
sir, I'll fight you.
Yeah, but I mean, no, I mean, I like it personally, but I can see why people would look at it and go, well, that's a bit lame. I was either going to say that or Critters, but Critters, like, I mean, it's Critters, right? So I lean a bit more towards Pumpkinhead because it's just, I don't know, it's just so just out there, really. Even for the 80s, I think it was a bit, what? So yeah, Pumpkinhead, I guess. Pumpkinhead.
Ross, defend Pumpkinhead.
I mean, I do like Pumpkinhead. It's got a great central monster. It's got Lance Henriksen. It's
brilliant.
It's got what you want. Stan Winston killed it with that film. But I guess to follow that, again, not really a guilty pleasure, but in terms of how it's seen or what it did, I guess Texas Chainsaw 2. Going from probably still one of the best, most disturbing horror films there is to making a horror comedy where it ends with a dual chainsaw fight, and there's like, it's a fun house more than it is a horror house, really. I mean, it's better than fun house as well. And just, they really went all the way with it. Dennis Hopper's brilliant in it. And it's so against what came before, which I think actually worked. They couldn't repeat what it was, but also in some ways sacrilegious, but by the guy who made that film. It's so bizarre, but it's just so enjoyable. I can't not say that.
Brandon, can you follow up Texas Chainsaw 2?
The movie I'm going to pick that's, one that's not for everybody for sure, but I really enjoy is the movie Blood Diner. It's a movie,
Nice.
It's so stupid, but it knows it's stupid. It has fun with how stupid it is. It's one of those movies where, if somebody walked in on you watching it, they could be like, what the hell is this? But it's, you could just say to them, what, a brain in a jar is trying to resurrect an ancient god at a concert where a Nazi rock band's playing. What's not to understand here?
Yeah, you're telling me that little Jimmy Hitler as a wrestler was not supposed to be serious?
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. So David, what is your secret love?
I don't know. I think that Chopping Mall probably lands on this list. I always looked at the art and the title alone, and I dismissed it for a very long time, just saying it's got to be so gory that I got to time it without having food in my stomach. And then when I finally got around to watching it, it was entirely the opposite of what I expected, and it was kind of it's sort of Johnny Five and Short Circuit meets the Terminator meets Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Porky's, and all of the above. I found it to be such an entertaining and ridiculous and happily craptastic mix of just really. I think it defines guilty pleasure in the best possible way.
I think that's my new favorite phrase: is happily craptastic. That's fantastic. Well done, sir. Well done.
Speaking of favorite scenes from an 80s horror film, Cecil, do you have a specific favorite that you can single out, and why?
Going back to The Thing again, the scene where Vance changes, where his chest opens up and then his head falls off and it grows legs and runs out the door. Terrifying. And again, another case of brilliant practical effects, because they didn't know how to get the head to run out the door. And so what they did was they took a bunch of chewing gum and put it under the head and stuck it to a skateboard and rolled it out the door. And so one of the most terrifying scenes in movie history is a head stuck to a skateboard on, of course you're not seeing that part of it. You're just seeing, the legs moving and it running out the door. But it's just ingenuity that comes with not having to rely on computer effects, because it's like, we need to get this shot. How are we going to make it happen? Hey, chewing gum, skateboard, brilliant.
Yes.
That is the definition of practical effects, if you ask me. Mm-hmm. Mr. H, what is your favorite?
Well, I think it counts as a horror movie, but They Live, and the scene, the extended fight scene that just goes on just a little bit too long. I love that. I think that's
it's still going on.
Oh, it's so good.
Recreated on South Park in detail.
Honestly,
brilliant.
It is the best scene, I think, of any movie from the 80s. It's just, I love that scene. I mean, it's not horror related at all, but sod it, who cares? It's fantastic.
Ross, how about you?
Oh, this is a really tough one. But in terms of just like an image, like a really key image that I remember is The Fog and the church scene, and just the way that Carpenter used his like widescreen frame, that he just was a master of utilizing every aspect of that, and just the production design and the music and the sound and everything that's like a perfect scene in like an imperfect movie that is elevated just by that being there. And they knew what they were making at that point, and it's been burnt on my brain for like 15 years or something since I saw that movie, because I sadly missed it, because I think a lot of people know about Halloween, sort of skip The Fog, know it had a shit remake, and then kind of carry on past that.
That.
It's a bit sad, really. You've got The Thing, you've got Halloween, and in between you've got this. It isn't the greatest movie, but they were making this pirate ghost film, and it has this really great cast, and its production design is wonderful, and the music is great, and it's sad that it does kind of get forgotten a bit, because as a whole it's flawed, but there are some incredible scenes in it, especially that one.
Oh, amazing atmosphere as well. And best supporting actor, kudos to The Fog itself and how it behaved.
It's got its own action figure now.
Brandon, what's burned in your brain as your favorite scene from 80s horror?
I'm going to pick another scene from The Thing, and it's the blood test scene. Because that's a part where you not only have like the big buildup where everything's quiet and he's sticking the hot needle into the blood, and then I mentioned earning jump scares before, and you get that great scare where he sticks the needle in and then the blood jumps up at him, and then it leads to another great, just gory practical effects sequence. So you have a quiet, tension-filled part, a great jump scare, and then some great, gory practical effects all in the same scene. And it also ends with that great line where He says, if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to not spend this winter tied to this fucking couch. And then fade out.
Nice.
Oh, that's wonderful. Jessica, let's move on. Let's talk about underrated or horror films.
Right. So the whole genre itself is fairly underrated, as we all know. Even when it wins an Oscar, we get told, "Oh, it's a thriller. It's not a horror movie." So what do you guys what would you consider the most underrated horror film from the 80s? Like one that not a lot of people think about or maybe forgotten. I know we've talked about The Fog. Cecil, why don't you go first?
I think one that does not get as much love as it deserves is going back again to John Carpenter, Prince of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
It is just a phenomenal film. It is atmospheric beyond so many other movies. There's so much going on. Even John Carpenter himself has admitted he doesn't even know what's going on. It's just... There's just so much depth to it. It's weird. It's got all kinds of Lovecraftian influences. It's just a great movie. It's visually appealing. It's brilliant, and it just does not get nearly the amount of love it deserves.
Good choice, Mr. H.
Well, I'm good. Well, I didn't know really where to kind of approach this from, and I'm going to say this is an underrated horror movie just from a pure, bafflingly comedic standpoint. Has anyone ever heard of The Keep?
Oh,
yes.
yes.
Yep.
I mean, need I say any more? Just, The Keep. Check it out.
I think when you say The Keep and baffling, I think we all know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So, I think because to be fair, I think a lot of the actual the 80s horror movies have been done very, very well, and I don't think they're underrated. I was thinking of approaching the question from a perspective of, the generations of today. Do they go back and watch, the wide variety of horror movies, and do they watch all of the good ones? And from that, I was going to answer with, something like The Fly, and because I don't think that's a well-watched movie from the generation of today, but just from a pure comedic standpoint, The Keep. What a baffling movie.
A quick thing about The Keep. Michael Mann, the original cut for that was 4 hours long.
Yeah.
Apparently,
insanity.
Apparently, it's supposed to be amazing, but he hates the film now and said that he will do everything in his power to make sure that no one ever sees it.
I mean, have you got 4 hours spare to spend on that? Jeez.
I mean,
I've spent 4 hours on worse things.
Might be less baffling.
how can you not want to listen to 4 hours of Tangerine Dream?
Yes,
Seriously.
I would do it. I sat through all the stupid Twilight movies. I think I could handle 4 hours of The Keep.
You hate yourself? Christ.
Apparently, I'm just a glutton for punishment.
Oh my God.
What are you doing?
I have problems.
Well, evidently.
He's got a mad crush.
Please tell me there was a woman involved in that. Like you.
No, actually, I was watching them because I like to. I wanted to watch the original films before I watched the Riff Tracks version. So that was really seriously. Like, now the first movie, not to get off on a tangent here, but the first movie I watched because I didn't really, nobody knew at the time. I didn't know I was like, oh, it's a vampire movie. And I'm like, what the hell is this? It's stupid vampire love. And then after that was when Riff Tracks started doing, the Mystery Science Theater treatment to it. And so I would watch the original so I would have a basis in how much I hated the movie to be able to enjoy the Riff Tracks more. So that makes sense.
As a female, as the lone female on this panel, I will say that book and the films are the best form of birth control because of what happens. It takes this 180 turn and becomes like David Cronenberg-esque body horror when her fetus decides to break her spine with a kick. So just FYI, that happens in Twilight.
You just made that entire series interesting all of a sudden.
Dude,
really?
I was reading the book because everybody was at the time, and I'm like, what the hell just happened? Before we get on a tangent, Brandon, please, what is your most underrated 80s horror film?
I don't know if this counts as a pure horror movie, but one movie that I can't believe doesn't have more of a cult following is the movie Life Force.
Yes.
And that's a movie.
Yes.
It's definitely not perfect, but there is so much crazy shit going on in that movie. And it also, in a way, it kind of has the feel of like something Hammer would have made if they had survived into the 80s and had a huge budget. Like it just has that sort of vibe to it. And it's a movie, it's finally starting to get more attention now. Like people like me and Cecil have covered it on our channels. But I mean, it's a movie about a naked space vampire, and it wasn't like some low budget indie movie. It was a big budget movie. Like how is it taking 30 years for people to talk about this movie? I don't get it.
2 words, Matilda May.
Yep.
Exactly.
There's a movie called Fade to Black, which is fantastic. And it's the first film to have Mickey Rourke in it.
And starring Dennis Christopher.
And it's about a movie maniac, literally, who loses his marbles and decides to become various characters from films that he loves and kills people as them. And there's a lot more going on with it, but it's a great film.
That's a great title. You know, it's interesting when you would go through the video store back in the day when video stores were everywhere. A lot of the times people would make their choices based on the VHS cover art alone. Is there any particular cover art that really stands out for you guys and really helped define your decisions before it became a favorite or not so favorite of the films you've watched? Cecil?
Can I quickly jump in? Could I just quickly jump in? Because I didn't actually get to answer the last question because you missed me out.
Apologies.
Oh, sorry.
I feel very left out on that.
I am so sorry.
No. By all means.
Please do.
I'll be quick. I just wanted to say I don't think anyone brings up The Entity almost ever, which is a extremely dark and potentially more relevant now than it was then in terms of how it handles certain themes about it, with a incredibly propulsive soundtrack, score that is devastating. And I think as far as propulsive horror goes and what it was talking about and things, that film handled its subject matter with a certain sensitivity that wasn't really around in that era so much, and I do think gets forgotten about a little bit too much.
Oh yeah, Barbara Hershey, amazing performance, and it's supposed to be based on a true story. Take that when you will.
That's where that movie was probably one of the most terrifying films for me, not only as a woman, but just because it was based on reality, supposedly, and that ending, because she never truly got away. It's very scary.
Was that cover art a good sell, do you think? Or was there something better? Cecil, what was your top choice when you'd go through the aisles?
Ghoulies. How can you... Ghoulie coming out of the toilet. I saw that and I'm like, I need to see this movie as quickly as possible. It's great. It's one of the most, I dare I say iconic, but it's like when you're talking 80s, you show the ghoulie coming out of the toilet and people just ghoulies, it's awesome, and yeah, I've always, I've loved that. There's been amazing, painted covers. There's been these just brilliant, like the Evil Dead 2 cover is just so good. And there's just been great covers over the years, but that one it's simple. It's pure. It's a ghoulie coming out of the toilet. It makes you want to see the movie.
My sister had the inflatable ad toilet.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was an inflatable ghoulie coming out of a toilet, and she had it for years.
I am very jealous.
Mr. H, how about you?
I would say Hellraiser. I really like that cover art. I think it's fantastic. Got good old Doug Bradley there, clutching a box. And having a whale of a time. He loves it as Pinhead. Yeah, I think that's a great cover art. I mean, the other stuff is fairly obvious choices to go down. The Fly's got a great cover art. The Thing has a great cover art. Even Aliens has a great cover art. But I don't know. I just like I like the Hellraiser cover art. I think it's cool.
Is that why you are Mr. H? Is the H stand for Hellraiser? Are you allowed to say?
Oh, no, it doesn't stand for anything. Just made it up. Literally just made it up for fun. And it's
Quick question about that. Were you aware of Pinhead and Hellraiser, or was that a discovery in the VHS aisle?
I first watched Hellraiser when I was like 3, I think. So, yeah, long time. Long time.
You said you watched Hellraiser when you were 3?
Yeah.
Wow.
They were so cute and cuddly.
Clearly not great parents. Very, very clearly.
Ross, what were you allowed to see when you saw the box art, and were you of the proper age or too young?
I actually had quite a protective dad, so I wasn't allowed. So I went for a long time, apart from that Aliens cover that Mr. H mentioned in the UK, of just Ripley looking at something off screen, which was brilliant, but wasn't allowed to see much of this stuff. So a lot of the things that I saw in the VHS aisles of Blockbuster were things that I didn't get to see for years after that. So I kind of had to just think what they would be. And I remember one that really stood out to me was Maniac. If you remember, the front cover of Maniac is just this horrifying image of a man holding a woman's scalp and a bloody knife. And it's so violent and so full of just sheer horror in what it is, and it is that very human, but it doesn't feel like a slasher horror. It just is a guy. I think he's wearing like a pair of jeans, maybe like a leather jacket, and then a scalp. And that just stood out to me more than anything else as like a ballsy cover. Like, I was surprised they could even put that on. I kind of still am, actually.
Oh yeah, and it's also this faceless entity, which made it that much more scary and mysterious.
And we also in the UK had, I remember quickly, the Vipco Vault of Horror, which was just I don't know if you had that in the States, just a series of cannibal Holocaust level stuff, and it would literally have the list of how many places that have been banned on the front, and then this big letters and all these skulls, and they were all over Blockbuster, and they were just, if you were a kid who wanted to see that sort of stuff, you knew that was going to be gnarly and you had to see it. I love those.
Brandon, how are you? What are your thoughts?
One that always stood out to me is the cover art for Return of the Living Dead 2, where you have I don't know if it's like supposed to be smoke or a cloud, but it's rising out of the graveyard and then it turns into the scary face. That's one where I'd like to have a poster of that. Oh, and then another one.
If I could just say, very reminiscent of Fright Night.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. But for some reason, that one always caught my eye. The cover of that one always caught my eye more. And then another one that always stood out to me, and I think this might be 90s, is Child's Play 2, where Chucky's got the big pair of scissors around the Jack in the Box. That one was memorable. I think just because of how scared the Jack in the Box looks on that cover.
So kind of going to the land of sequels and remakes. I mean, we just saw how Halloween just knocked it out of the park this year.
Oh, you're not going to like me.
I mean, you can't take away from the box office. I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah, true.
And Robert Englund's talking about a really cool idea for a final Nightmare on Elm Street with different actors playing Freddy Krueger. Because
and LeBron James is doing a new Friday the 13th.
Exactly. He's wanting to. What 80s movies would you like to see either remade or have a sequel that would be good for it, like would be worth doing? Cecil, you first.
I don't know. Like, initially when they started doing the late sequels, I was excited because I was like, oh, this is a really cool idea. We're not getting, remakes. We're getting like late sequels. And I'm like, I'm kind of cool with that. And then they started to come out and they all sucked. I haven't seen the new Halloween yet, so I can't say if it's good or not. But I'm just saying, of the ones that I've seen of all the late sequels, they've all been awful. And they've all been soft reboots anyway. So it was just it was irritating because it was like, oh, you can do this. And then they're like, oh, they're still not fully committing. So I don't know. I'm not really big on the current wave of remakes because I think that they're really lazy. They're just taking the best elements of them, of the original film, watering them down, making them PG-13ified and throwing them out there. And they're succeeding, sadly. So I mean, if I'm gonna come up with something that's gonna be a late sequel, I would go with what Brandon brought up. Do a late sequel to Life Force. The comets come back around to Earth, and here's they can come up with some other wacky reason for what's gonna happen. I would be cool with that if they could pull it off, but they probably wouldn't. And
you're already given up on your.
Well, I'm saying they're not going to dedicate to having a completely naked woman walk around for 90% of the film in today's market. They would. I mean, there's no way they'd be able to get that PG-13. So they'd give it to some popular actress on the CW to walk around in like a bodysuit, and it just the shock value of it was like, I mean, that scene where Matilda May comes up and the doctor's in the room and she's naked. I mean, it's the shock value of like, oh, what? And then, she drains the life out of the guy. It was something else. So, if they would be willing to go balls out on it and make the movie, if they make a proper sequel, I would be cool with them doing Life Force. But most likely they're just going to make more terrible, bad remakes of other beloved classics.
I would turn it around and say that if they did it like they did Ash versus Evil Dead, which was fantastic, and possibly do a series, you could probably get away with that on HBO thanks to things like Game of Thrones, where that's basically what they wear.
That's true. I mean, if they could do a series or something, maybe do it as like a short miniseries, 6 episodes or something, they could pull it off. But I don't know. It's just I've seen so many terrible films recently. It's kind of soured me a little bit.
Yeah.
Mr. H, what about you?
See, I am really sick of all of the remakes and the sequels, and yeah, I'll get flamed for it. I didn't like Halloween. I thought it played on nostalgia too much in a time where we've moved forward. These entities that just slash and cut people up, they're cheesy and comedic now. They're not relevant today. They have become caricatures over their over the way they've been mishandled through their franchise. I can't take Michael Myers seriously when he just disappears between shots, because all I can think of is, oh, he must be sprinting. He's doing a Usain Bolt. Like, it's just not. There's no way I can take that shit seriously. They are not. They are caricatures. They're comedic now. And I'll get flamed for this, but. Because my audience will go, oh, I know what he's going to say. I would say if you move away from something like that and you go to caricatures, which, yeah, they've been mishandled, but they're not the same because they've not been thrust into the limelight as much. And they didn't have an entire subgenre of horror built around them. Hellraiser. If you work on something like that and you make it, I mean, it has to be leagues above what it has been, leagues above, and it needs to be better than the first one. But if you work on Hellraiser and you make a solid remake, and no, it doesn't have to go back to Clive Barker. Everyone's screaming that. It doesn't have to go back to Clive Barker. Anyone read the Scarlet Gospels, that's your answer as to why. That would be good, because everything else, Freddy, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, all of these other things, that's the slasher subgenre. Even the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, slasher subgenre. And they're comedic. I can't take that shit seriously in this day and age. No one can. Barely anyone can. And the only reason Halloween is succeeding is because it plays on nostalgia. If you watch it, it's not a well-made film. And the fact that it had heavy reshoots establishes that, because the stuff that they've had to cut out and the reason the story is so choppy in parts, again, no spoilers, because I know some of you haven't watched it, is a testament to that fact. It plays on nostalgia, where we're in a world where nostalgia doesn't work like that anymore, not for that particular genre. Maybe for Americans, but I know a lot of UK-based people haven't enjoyed it. I know that. It's either, so I would say either, I've rambled for too long, I would either say Hellraiser, or I would say something like The Fly. I feel like The Fly, like body horror things, could get a good remake and it would be taken seriously. Yeah, there you go. That's my answer.
All right.
And, well, we've got Rabid coming out soon by the Soska sisters, so we'll see how that goes with the Cronenberg remake. Ross, what about you?
Well, I'm going to come in immediately and say that I friggin' love the new Halloween movies.
Yes.
I thought it was.
As someone who edits, you disappoint me with that.
I just thought it was. I just thought it was awesome. I came out of that cinema smiling ear to ear, and I'm going to watch it again and again, I think. So, and in terms of that, you know, I understand the problems of it, but I think that there is maybe a space for, again, more remakes than sequels, just because I do think that is an outlier in terms of the very late sequel.
Just to interject there then, because, you know, let's have a little bit of discourse about it. And I'm not going to hijack this whole discussion, but do you feel that you enjoyed it because it's nostalgia? Because you've already admitted that there were some issues with it. So do you feel you've overlooked the big mistakes of the movie plainly because it pulled on your nostalgia? Because I saw your video,
I didn't think it had. I didn't think it had many big mistakes in it. I didn't think it was that bad anyway. I think it had some issues, but, you know, I genuinely really liked it, regardless of the nostalgia factor. It played on some of the things that I like about the Halloween series, but I'm not a huge fan of that series apart from the first one and maybe the fourth one. So I just loved it. But I would love them maybe with directors like Anna Lily Amapour doing really interesting work these days. If someone like that could take on a film like Near Dark.
Oh, nice.
I think that is just an underseen movie that kind of gets forgotten, but it is a great film and it doesn't need a remake. But I think that I can't imagine how you would get that film seen by more people nowadays. Like, I just don't think it comes up very much. And there are interesting filmmakers out there that could do a lot with its weird. It's like a weird Western vampire film with incredible imagery and full of amazing James Cameron character actors, and obviously it was directed by a woman at a time when that didn't happen very much, and she just made a balls out movie that was, you know, anyone could have made. It didn't matter who she was, and it was fantastic. And I think and you can go on and do that again. Like there was
a lot of talk at the time when Bill Paxton was still alive that he and Lance Henriksen wanted to do a prequel to show the stories of how they came together. And that would be amazing.
Yeah, that would be so cool. I do think there's a lot in that movie that was unexplored and could have been more. Even though I love that it just exists on its own, I just think that everyone who's seen it, everyone who's going to see it has probably seen it. So you could do more with that idea.
Brandon, how about you?
I'm going to offer an idea for both a remake and a potential sequel. The remake idea, one I think that they could do that wouldn't make a lot of people angry is I did the movie on my channel, Silver Bullet. And that's a movie where there's a potential for a good horror movie there. Like, it's a werewolf movie where the werewolf is also a creepy priest. But in the original movie, I don't think it's. Yeah, it's they make it pretty obvious in the original. But like I say, I don't think the original Silver Bullet's completely terrible, but there's definitely stuff that could have been done better. Like I mentioned in my video that when they finally show the werewolf, it looks more like a were-wombat. But that's the case where, you know, the original is not looked upon as this untouchable classic. So I don't think the idea of a remake would piss too many people off. And if it's done right, yeah, that could potentially be a good horror movie. And then for the sequels, I'm going to say Halloween, but go back to the Halloween 3 concept and make it an anthology instead of doing the same Michael Myers stuff over and over again, where it's like, okay, we're doing these sequels. Now we're going to do another sequel, but only the first 2 movies count. Actually, Rob Zombie's going to remake it. Actually, we're done with that. We're going to make another sequel to the original, but just the first one counts. Like, stop with that shit. And go, like, there's the potential of you could have a movie out every year at Halloween. The only common thread is that it's set on Halloween night, and you could do something different every movie. That's something that would set it apart from the other slasher movie sequels out there. I know it'll never happen, but that would be my idea for something that you could potentially sequelize.
I love it.
I think the closest thing we'll get to that is if they manage to be able to continue with Trick or Treat. That just got completely screwed over by the studio. It sat on a shelf for years, gets released, people immediately love it. And people are begging for a sequel, and the studio is just sitting on their hands about it. They've got a gold mine on their hands. They've got a yearly anthology series that they could do, and they just, for whatever reason, they don't want to do it.
I was just talking about that movie on my show, and I mentioned the fact that the kid that played Sam is now like 18. It's like, good God, they've waited so long. It's so, oh God. David, he could have gone through puberty. Sam could have went through puberty. David, what about you?
Well, I'm content with sequels and follow-ups. I'm just not a reboot person, very much like the collective here. And there's so many to choose from that I don't want to do. I'm pretty content with the way things are, but I would say Scanners movies. I could definitely see a continuation with that storyline and that saga and those effects in a practical state of mind. I think would be very, very fun. Explosive.
We had like 3. There was even Scanner Cop at one point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
God help us.
recently there was a movie from Joe Begos that came out called The Mind's Eye. It is a very much spiritual sequel to Scanners. Really good. I mean, it's basically Scanners without calling it Scanners. I mean, head explosions, but it's very cool. I really recommend checking it out. It only came out a couple years ago.
Very cool. Well, we're doing really great here. I want to ask 2 more questions of everybody, and then we'll wrap things up. You have these wonderful horror icons that are created in these films in the 80s, but you also have heroes and heroines. Out of all of these that are introduced in these movies, which 80s horror characters remain relevant today and why? Cecil.
Well, for hero, I got to go with the obvious one, Ash. He just, like Bruce Campbell, he managed to not play the character for like well over 2 decades, and then comes back and does the Ash versus the Evil Dead series and knocks it out of the park again. Mm-hmm. It was just really good and showed just how beloved he is and how beloved those movies are and how much fun they are and how like he's just great. Like there are certain movies where you have somebody you're like, this was the role they were born to play. Well, I mean, that was really the role that he was born to play, because I've seen him in dozens of movies and he's great, but like, I think that was really like his high watermark. That was his point. That's for the hero. For the bad guy, it's also an easy one, but I've always loved Jason Voorhees. There's just something about he was the kid that died that came back from the dead, but not really. And he's become like the undying spirit of vengeance and is just this unstoppable force of will. It's great. He's cool. And I met Kane Hodder, who was about a foot taller than I was, and it was just the nicest guy. But you're like, holy crap, just this imposing person next to you, and you're like, yeah. I mean, he's not the only Jason, obviously, but he is the pretty much the pinnacle of Jason, and he's awesome. And I've always liked Jason Voorhees, with the exception of 9. 9 can get flushed down a toilet.
Yes. Mr. H, hero, villain, either or both?
Well, I'll just say one. I would say hero. I would say McCready, the Thing. I'd say he's still very, very relevant. I mean, people still discuss who was, human at the end of the Thing till this day. So, yeah, I'd say McCready.
Ross?
I'm going to say a villain, and in terms of it being relevant today, I think to go a bit darker, that Jack Torrance and being this kind of masculine father figure who loses his mind and tries to destroy his family is sadly as relevant, if not more so now than it was then. And just the way that he can't handle what is happening around him and the outward, I guess, voices that are telling him to do things and turning him against someone just because he's a struggling artist, if you will, who feels misunderstood is incredibly relevant and still incredibly terrifying. And that's why, for me, that probably is the single greatest horror movie of the 1980s, is just for that single character.
Brandon, who remains relevant today that really stands out for you for 80s horror character?
the character I'm going to name isn't relevant in terms of popularity, but one that I think still holds up after all these years is I'm going to say Henry from the movie Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer.
Oh, good choice.
Because this is one where he's a serial killer, but he's not a slasher movie villain. The character was actually based off of, I think, a couple real serial killers.
Henry Lee Lucas, I think.
And yeah, and I think they combined his like MO with another guy. I might be mixing that up, but yeah, it was, he doesn't wear a mask. It's he's not a silent, lumbering guy, and he's a more realistic, even though he's fictional, he's a realistic killer. And I think that's something that even people who don't like the Friday the 13th style movies, but don't mind watching a scary movie could still like that today.
Jessica, let's round this out with our final question for our panel.
You got it. So this is really the bare bones of what we've been talking about. And in comparison to films today, were horror movies better in the 80s than they are now? With the rise of VHS, there was a lot of independent films going on. There was a lot more experimentation being allowed. So with all of that variety going on, do you think that horror movies are better in the 80s? Cecil?
This kind of does encompass everything that we've been talking about, because when the 80s, yes, there was a lot of exploitation, but there was also a lot of experimentation. They took different ideas and just sometimes would just throw everything at a film to see what worked and what didn't. And there was a lot of ripoffs, and there was a lot of exploitation. They would exploit something that was popular, slashers and all that. But now we're seeing another element of exploitation, and that is something that doesn't really get talked about as much, but I brought it up before in conversation: nostalgia exploitation, where what we were talking about earlier, it's like with the new Halloween. Again, I haven't seen it, so I can't say, but it seems like they'll take the nostalgia of something and present that, and people fall in love with it, when really they're falling in love with what you've already presented them with. So, hey, remember this? Remember how great this was? Well, here it is, and it's great again. And they're not really doing anything new. They're just presenting you with a idea of something that already existed, and maybe slapped a couple of, a nice new paint job on it, throw in some references here and there, a couple of homages, maybe a cameo here and there. Next thing you know, everybody's giving it, 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. And when you get down to the basics of it, it's really hollow and empty. And it's just playing off of everyone's memory of something that was superior. But now everyone's acting like the new one is the cool thing, when the original thing is it's not cool anymore. It's not good. This new shiny thing is what's hot. So I think as far as horror now, the best horror is not coming is not coming from Hollywood. It's not coming out of the U.S. We've had the new French Extreme, which brought us Inside, Martyrs, High Tension, Irreversible, Raw, some brilliant, gory, tremendously well-constructed films that are so far removed from anything that you've previously seen that you really do need to sit up and take notice to them. And I think that there are a lot of the J-horror films, or the films that are taking chances, and all that Hollywood is doing is taking previous films, remaking them, and then taking a lot of foreign films, taking out what made them good, and then remaking them in English for an English language audience, because people don't like reading subtitles.
Well, and I would actually say, kind of in answer to that too, movies like Mandy take what you're talking about in the 80s style and kind of modernize it a little bit and let it go, and it's amazing to watch.
Oh, I'm not saying that it doesn't, like, it can't be done well. I mean, it can be. It certainly can be done well. As I said, with like The Void I thought was fantastic, and The Void was very much steeped in the 80s. But it just seems that, like, with a lot of the stuff, they're just taking like, hey, you remember this? This was what was really cool. And they're missing the point of what made it cool to begin with, and just doing a hollow version of it.
Yeah, South Park hit that berry on the head pretty good.
Oh, yeah. Memphis.
Mr. H, how about you? What do you think?
I don't know, to be honest. I think unfortunately a lot of people are missing some of the really, really good horror movies of today. Or maybe palettes have changed. Maybe I'm just out of touch. Who the hell knows? But a lot of people, one of the movies which seems to be quite divisive, which came out this year, but is more of a callback to 70s horror. And I would say it tops a lot of the 80s stuff. Actually, was Hereditary. I thought that was fantastic.
That's great.
And that's a very 70s horror movie in tone, but with modern day sensibilities and the technology behind it, which I think was absolutely astounding. And I wouldn't say horror movies were better in the 80s than they are now. I think, unfortunately, horror has been looked at in the 80s with a higher regard, and we shit on a lot of the good horror movies which are released today, or there's not an abundance of horror movies today. There are still really good horror movies today, but unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people see them. There's a movie that's just been released today called The Super with Val Kilmer in it, and that's a great movie. It's a tight little film, and it works. It's not Oscar winning by any chance, but it's a good film, and because it's released direct to streaming, no one's going to see it. But it's a fantastic little film. So I wouldn't say so much that 80s horrors were better. I just think people were watching them more.
Starting to find their audience, and perhaps the movies of today will take some time to find their audience. But I think all these things come down to word of mouth.
Yeah, true.
It's also the going to the video store and hunting and finding them and then talking about them directly to your friends was one of the best parts of it, I think, too. And that's why a lot of people feel that connection to VHS so much still, too. Ross, what about you?
I don't think that 80s horror films were better then. I don't agree with that. I don't know if they were worse either. I think one thing in the 80s that maybe we've lost a little bit of is that there was a certain sense of humor in everything they did. There was a certain joy to what they were always doing. I mean, to name drop ever so slightly, I remember I worked for John Landis when I was 18 as his assistant very briefly. And one thing he told me was, I remember I showed him like a film and he said, the thing you need to do is there has to always be that sense of humor to what you're doing. There has to be that feeling of, for the horror to work, there has to be that relief in the humor. And I think that does get forgot about a little bit nowadays, which is a bit sad, because it does. You see it a lot in the Avengers films where I actually don't think you need it as much. It becomes a bit annoying where they just crack jokes all the time. But to make you fall in love with characters a little bit more, if you joke with them when watching the film, you don't want them to get hurt and die. And I think we've lost that a little bit.
Good answer. Brandon, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, whether or not they were better is subjective. I do think in the 80s, as far as the mainstream was concerned, I think horror movies were a bit more comfortable with what they were. One thing people complain about nowadays is the PG-13ification of a lot of horror movies. Like studios are like, well, we got to appeal to young people. And I think in the 80s, they knew like, no, young people like these and they want them to be rated R. Don't worry. They're going to sneak into the theater and see these things anyway. Like, let's just go for it. And they also, when it came to, combining, comedy and horror, they kind of went for it. And we're like, well, we don't really care if people think this is weird. We're going to do it anyway. So I think that, and I'm talking more for like sort of the big theatrically released mainstream movies here, but I think that's one key difference between 80s horror movies and ones now.
Well, and that brings up a good point about like movies like Gremlins that were PG, I believe, when they were released, but they kill people in that movie. They kill people in horrible ways, and we hear about a dead dad in a Santa Claus suit rotting in a chimney, and that's part of the story.
And that's a case where this isn't an R-rated movie that we're going to try and water down. It's a PG movie that we're going to try and push as far as we can.
Exactly.
So.
Right, and between that and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, thus became the PG-13 rating. Those were pretty much, those two films were the impetus to sort of find an in-between rating.
Thank you, Mola Ram. Thank you for that. Thank you for that heart, baby. You got it.
Well, I want to thank everybody for taking the time. I want to thank our roundtable panelists for taking the time to contribute such a great, heartfelt conversation about 80s horror. Cecil, where can we find you on YouTube and your social channels?
You can find me at GoodBadFlicks on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, and 1201beyond.com.
Mr. H?
You can find me at Mr. H Reviews on YouTube, occasionally Instagram if I can be bothered, and Twitter, which I'm on daily. So, yeah, and YouTube and all that, I think I said. So, yeah.
Ross, how about you?
And you can just find me at Rossatron on YouTube, and that's pretty much where I kind of stick around. So, yeah, go there.
And Brandon?
You can find me on YouTube. Just type my name, Brandon Tenold. I should pop up. Pretty sure I'm the only Brandon Tenold on there at this moment. And I'm also on Twitter at Brandon Tenold and on Facebook at Official Brandon Tenold.
Excellent. Well, I also want to address our listeners. In Search of Darkness, a journey into iconic 80s horror, still has a few days to go on Kickstarter. We're making the definitive documentary of the genre by bringing the horror community together, like we did today, to celebrate the most iconic era in cinema history. It's going to be a fun one. Please head over to Kickstarter to consider backing our project and take home a piece of 80s horror history. You could also join in on the discussion with us on social media. Just look for our handle, 80s Horror Doc, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So everyone, I really appreciate your time. Thank you all again. Stay tuned for more of us in Search of Darkness, a journey into iconic 80s horror.